middle shot photos with foreground image, and I asked them to describe what they saw in those photos any way they liked, given a limit of time. So well, and what emerged is that despite similar picture, participants described images in a different way. For instance, American participants, they were pretty much concise in describing the images, and it was more like the only object, foreground object that they saw in the photo. Like if you look at this particular photo stimulus, they would go and describe it like oranges. Well, whereas, for instance, Mexican participants provided a very conceptual description, shopping. Chinese were pretty much detailed in describing what they saw in the foreground and background. Indian students were pretty much sophisticated and provided philosophical descriptions of what they saw in the picture. And Russians were pretty much, how to say, so I called that pattern of description nesting doll description. They circled around this image of oranges and set a broader context of consideration. It was something like stores, supermarket, products, fruit, citrus, orange happiness. So well, sometimes they even did not name oranges, but just tried to use some epithets, whatever. So it was obvious that, yes, we see similar images, but we describe them and we in a different way, and we attach importance to different elements in those images. So well, then when I was admitted to my PhD program, I started exploring more the effects of thinking style on the way we process and structure information. But the studies that I kind of looked through a lot of studies, they provide inconclusive evidence of thinking style effects. On the one hand, most of the studies report thinking style effects on visual aesthetics in user-generated in user-generated cultural products like photos or painting or drawings or advertising. But effects of thinking style is not always reported in evaluative judgments of messages created in accordance with either holistic or analytic style. And it is mostly true in some visual search tasks. So it seems like people prefer simplicity rather than complexity of information when they're looking for a product. So, well, one more study which was really critical for me was the one conducted by psychologists from the department, scholars from the Department of Psychology of University of Illinois, and they tried to replicate the key studies conducted by cultural psychologists, and they could not repeat the results. So the results were either insignificant across two cultural groups of participants, Chinese and American participants, or they showed the opposite effect. So this being said, having this kind of inconclusive evidence and at the same time having this kind of intuition that culture still matters, well, at least in user-generated cultural products, I came with an idea to design a study in which I would ask participants to take selfies with brands and see whether visual aesthetic, or see whether the way they take selfies with brands, either allowing more background information or providing a close-up of their own image with the brand. So whether this matter and whether there are these differences congruent with thinking style. So, well, and again, originally, selfies were considered to be an instrument to understand whether culture does matter in these restricting conditions of selfie technology when you take a selfie to the length of your arm. Well, and just again, the question was whether Russian and Chinese participants who are holistic processes, or would they maximize the length of their arm to allow more space into the picture frame or not? So that was an original idea. And yes, I situated selfies in the history of self-portraits based on similar ontological roots. See me showing you me, based on similar compositional conventions characterized by narrowing of the field and framing in which the subject dominates the foreground of the image, and also based on similar features of self-depiction, of which elongated arm is one of them. So, and to hypothesize about effects of thinking style on visual aesthetics, I draw upon studies of cultural psychologists who compared paintings of East Asian and Western artists in terms of aesthetic features, such features as body to frame ratio of the model, complexity of visual information, contrast, and location of the horizon line. And they reported that these aesthetic features, they differed across self-portraits and portraits of American and Chinese artists. And the choice helped artists to emphasize either the figure of the person in the portrait, in case with Western artists, or make equally important the figure of the person and the foreground as well. So, for instance, if we look at the first self-portrait of Otto Dix, we see that there is this high contrast between the figure and the background, no complexity at all. We don't see in this particular painting location of the horizon line, but it is low if we talk about kind of the viewing perspective. And body to frame ratio is relatively large. So compared to the second painting that was done by Zhang Detian in 1964, here we have smaller body to frame ratio. Instead of contrast, we see this fuzziness between the figure of the artist and background information. We see more complexity, and we see higher location of the horizon line again. So, well, the idea in those studies was that artists give preference to those aesthetic features that either highlight the figure of the person, him or herself, or they make the person and the background equally important. So unfortunately, those studies did not consider self-portraits of Russian artists, but one study conducted by cultural psychologist Grossman reported holistic thinking of Russian participants. So it made me believe that representatives from China and Russia would take selfies in a similar holistic way. Again, these studies, I drew from those studies, and I hypothesized that Russian and Chinese participants will take brand selfies with lower contrast, with smaller body to frame ratio, with higher location of the horizon line and higher complexity of background information, whereas American analytic processes will maximize the selfie, the image of the person by using higher contrast, a larger body to frame ratio, lower location of the horizon line, and lower complexity of background information. I also hypothesize that cultural differences in aesthetic features will be noticeable in brand selfies taken by US, Chinese, and Russian participants in similar product type conditions, irrespective of their object. To run a study and just to test my hypothesis, we first develop 4 visual content measurement scales. So the first one was body to frame ratio, and it drew upon typology of photo shots accepted and typical in photography. And the scale had, it was a 5-point scale. And the first 2 values corresponded to analytic type of visual aesthetics with selfie takers providing a close-up of the person's head or medium close-up from the shoulders up. Then there was this kind of neutral value in between holistic and analytic style of body to frame ratio, and values 4 and 5 corresponded to holistic style of body to frame ratio. So, location of the horizon line scale was based on rule of thirds grid, and it also had 5 point. It was a 5-point scale. The same approach. Then with contrast, in the first study, our scale drew upon histogram of color distribution, and it had also 5 values, 5 points, with the first end point describing analytic type of analytic style of contrast with 2 pikes on opposing ends of the histogram. And you can see the histogram here, and you can see this contrasting image of a person against a monochrome background. And the final endpoint corresponded to holistic style in contrast representation. And in terms of histogram of color distribution, it manifested in midtones bunched up with an empty area on each end. And if we look at the selfie image, we see this fuzziness in the image. So later, it was still a little bit subjective scale. And later in the second study, we came with another scale. It was a self-reported scale based on participants' use of contrast filters in social media. Yes. And finally, the last aesthetic feature complexity of information. It was measured based on typology of brand selfie assemblages and visual complexity offered by scholars you see in the slide. So we conducted a pilot study, and in this pilot study, we asked participants to take selfies, 3 selfies, one with sunglasses, another with coffee in a typical place of coffee consumption, and the third with a favorite brand. And we asked them to post those selfies in Google folder deliberately designed for this particular study. So why coffee and sunglasses brand product types for this particular studies? We are further we further restricted our participants, even biased our participants to take selfies either in object-oriented way or field-oriented, holistic way. So it was for us interesting to understand whether, for instance, sunglasses condition, which was analytic by default, so you need to take a selfie focused on sunglasses, whether even this product condition predisposes holistic processes, bring more background information or less background information, and vice versa, whether coffee condition taken in a typical place of consumption predisposed analytic processes bring more field rather than less field. I hope it makes sense. So we also conducted a survey where we asked several questions, of open-ended questions about how participants took selfies, what matters to them, so that we could better interpret the results, because sometimes selfies looked a little bit similar, and just you had to know more in terms of contrast, for instance, to interpret them in a more accurate way. So originally we have in our pilot study, we have 25 participants in each country group, and we screened them by age, by language. So they had to be monolingual native speakers from either Russia or the United States, country of origin, and those were predictors of processing style based on Nisbet. So we again used participant selfies and online survey to collect data, and we analyzed those selfies using all these 4 visual content scales described earlier, and 2 independent bilingual, Russian English, and 2 monolingual human coders helped us to do so. And we conducted 2-way ANOVAs to test and analyze the results. So results demonstrated that, so we conducted 4 ANOVAs, factorial ANOVAs, to test effects of thinking style on each aesthetic feature. The results reported that culture does matter in body to frame ratio feature, meaning that analytic American processes, participants, they created selfies with a larger body to frame ratio, and Russians created selfies with a smaller body to frame ratio. So this particular ANOVA also demonstrated interaction effect of culture and product, and it was mostly due to this favorite brand condition, And it is explainable because so while each person, so the condition was incompatible within and between groups, and participants were to choose whatever they liked so well, and they could choose a t-shirt or a dress or earrings or whatever, and it definitely was a confounded variable that affected body to frame ratio. But again, if looking at this compatible to product conditions, we see that there is truly culture effect on body to frame ratio. So complexity demonstrated significant effect of culture in all three product conditions. So Russian participants took selfies with higher complexity of information, and American participants took selfies with less complexity in the background. Contrast also demonstrated significant effects of culture, but the effects were opposite to our expectations. So Russians preferred to take selfies with a higher contrast and Americans with a lower contrast, so that this hypothesis was not supported. Unfortunately, we also could not test hypothesis measuring effects of culture on location of horizon line, because we collected only 7 and 9 selfies altogether into groups with identifiable horizon line. And though the means were different, not significant, different, but we could not definitely claim significant results because of this very few examples. So our second study, main study, it was similar to the first one. We tested the same hypothesis. We tested the same effect of the thinking style on 4 aesthetic features, but there were some changes in study procedure and design based on earlier limitations. So first we added one more group of participants. They were Chinese participants who are holistic processes. We increased our sample size from 25 to 50 participants. In each group, exception was originally we planned to recruit 50 participants in each group, but because of COVID, we were not able just to recruit participants in the right number of American participants. So then, instead of asking participants to take a selfie with a favorite brand, we came and asked them to take selfie with a landmark brand, meaning that they had to take a selfie with some scenic view in the background or with some attraction in the background, so that we could definitely measure location of the horizon line. Then instead of using histogram of color distribution, we used self-reported contrast values. So participants were to choose contrast values when taking selfie and posting them using one of the filters available to them. So and instead of asking them to post selfies in Google folder, so we created more natural setting. We created a study Instagram account and asked them just to post selfies with captions in that account. So the results of study 2 were similar to the results of study 1. Again, all 3 features reported earlier, body to frame ratio, location of horizon line, and complexity, demonstrated culture effects. meaning that American participants took selfies with larger body to frame ratio, with lower location of horizon line and with lower complexity, whereas Russian and Chinese participants, they took selfies with, with smaller body to frame ratio, with higher location of horizon line, with higher complexity. And again, the only feature which did not show the effect of culture was contrast. And so in fact, it was significant, but it showed opposite direction. Okay, so well, then we came with an idea within the same study to measure evaluative responses of participants to selfies to selfies designed in accordance with thinking style. So, and we hypothesized that holistic processes from Russia and China would give preference to selfies demonstrating or designed using this holistic style of 4 features, and American participants will give preference to selfies that are used analytic style in representing those 4 features. So well, and we developed 4 pairs of stimuli, and each pair manipulated selfie along one aesthetic feature. For instance, here you see a pair of stimuli manipulating body to frame ratio. In the first case, we see larger body to frame ratio. In the second case, we see a smaller body to frame ratio. And we asked participants to choose one of them that they liked more. So, and we use direct comparison measure to evaluate participants' responses and preferences to selfies designed in accordance to either holistic or analytic style. Well, we conducted Pearson's chi-square goodness or fit statistic. We conducted Pearson's chi-square goodness of fit and association tests to understand within and between group significance with respect to each of these 4 features. And so the results showed first, for instance, if we look at this summary table exploring within culture preferences to selfies designed in analytical holistic style, we see that the only significance demonstrated horizon line feature within each group, meaning that each group gave preference to one particular style of selfie representation, but opposite to our prediction, all groups gave preference to selfies with lower location of the horizon line, but not higher location of the horizon line. So we see this between group differences. So they are not significant, but they are significant within each cultural group. So body to frame ratio did not report effects of culture. So complexity reported preference based on thinking style with respect to Russian participants and Chinese participants. It did not report significance with respect to US participants, and contrast was significant, but again, it showed opposite direction. So overall, conclusion is that culture showed robust results, except contrast in user-generated consumer selfies, but it did not hold true in evaluative responses to selfies congruent with participants' thinking style, with the exception of complexity. Complexity was more or less robust with respect to Russian and Chinese participants. Okay, there are a couple of implications for a couple of theoretical and managerial implications as a result of these two studies. First, it is one of the first known studies to systematically predict and find cultural differences with respect to the ways that consumers construct user-generated content in social media using thinking style construct. Then the study findings are in line with earlier studies on computer-mediated communication that reported culture effects on complexity in consumers' responses. So well, and this appears to be a robust cultural finding again. So well, with some exceptions. The finding expand the generalizability of earlier studies on social psychology that provided evidence of Russians as holistic thinkers. There are very, very few studies that explored effects, not even effects that explore the type of thinking style of this particular cultural group. As for managerial implications, consumer brand selfies are in general considered to be part of snapshot aesthetics characterized by authentic, organic look of posts people place in their accounts. And so they might provide valuable insights for ad designers in terms of how to create authentic, organic images of brands. So we suggest that they should consider the cultural background of consumers when creating posts on social media, as they differ in the level of spontaneity, staging, and type of communication. And also ad designers should be scrupulous in manipulating aesthetic features. They should exercise different level of visual complexity, in particular in brand posts targeted at analytic and heuristic consumers, with recommended lower complexity in the first case and the higher complexity in the second case. So it is basically all, and just this is a list of some key references that I used in my study, and just I would like to thank Professor Michelle Nelson, my advisor, and just who helped a lot, just and guided a lot through all these two studies, and co-authors in 5 national markets who helped collect data for these two studies. I'm also thankful to my dissertation committee members who are very strict and who helped me to better understand how to operationalize culture, or rather how difficult it is just to pin culture and explore its effects. And definitely I'm thankful to the Center of Global Studies who invited me to give this talk. Thank you. And welcome to questions if you have any. So I would rather probably stop sharing, or probably I will stay as it is. So, and just, I assume that, okay, whatever.
All right, thank you so very much for this very interesting talk. And while we are waiting for participants to put questions into the Q&A, and I'll just remind you that there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen where you can put those questions in.
Okay. Okay,
I have one to start us off first. Your study has a great deal of crossover in the marketing field. Have you published your study in any form? And if so, has it generated any interest from industry, especially those industries that you are currently marketing with those selfies?
so it's a good question. We presented our pilot study in 2020 at American Academy, American Association of Advertising, and it was really a huge success. And I was happy because there were participants from University of Illinois who in fact created analysis holism scale to provide more accurate measurement of thinking style. And we also submitted our paper in the Journal of Advertising, and it was rejected. And we I understand and accept all kind of reasons, because just it was really, really much, there were a lot of work. It was a pilot study and a lot of work to do. And we resubmitted in a different journal and wait for the results. So we were recommended to introduce some changes, and we did that, and we are waiting for the response.
Okay.
Yes.
Interesting.
It's interesting that, again, just culture is so much difficult to measure, that it is the topic of culture and its effect is pretty much popular in countries where consumers are holistic, like my co-authors in my country. They were so much excited about the study, and Chinese also are pretty much excited, but so kind of scholars in the United States, which exercise probably better, more accurate precision in study design, so they're a little bit more skeptical.
I see.
Yes.
That too is an interesting finding in and of itself. Trying to position it to different journals.
Yes. And it was kind of weird, the way it was rejected by the Journal of Advertising. I understand it, and we agreed with my advices, because it was more about cultural psychology, it was more about thinking style, it was less about advertising. And so we were trying kind of, okay, here what we are doing, this is selfie, and selfie is a method, sort of a tool that helps us to understand whether thinking style does matter. It was less about advertising or application in advertising and marketing. And the second study that we submitted in a different journal, it was more about brand selfies, and it's really a huge popularity right now. Consumer selfies, brand selfies, because of this authenticity, etc., and kind of this idea, and because of this kind of global addiction with selfies, really. And so we kind of reframed our study, making it more applicable to advertising and consumer research fields rather than to cultural psychology field.
Right, because it does provide great insight into that.
Yes.
So this study is applicable to both types of journals. You write it in one particular way to appeal to cultural psychology, because it has those elements within it, but also in another particular style to highlight those elements that would be relevant to the advertising aspect.
Yes.
And then you get 2 articles out of it. Welcome to academia.
Well, while we're waiting for more questions, I have a lot. This was a really interesting study, or 2 studies. But maybe sort of jumping off your answer to Donna in the last part, can you talk a little bit?
Tim, you cut out.
Really interested in the difference that in the American context, the what you called favorite brand made. Can you talk a little bit about, maybe in qualitative terms, what was going on there?
Well, to begin with, the choice of brands was different, with Americans giving preference to sport apparel, t-shirts, kind of baseball caps, something dealing with sport pretty much, whereas Russian participants were more focused on, again, some brands related to beauty, some earrings, some even hairstyle, or, well, something related to cosmetics rather than sport. So it was a big difference. So other than that, definitely because condition was incompatible in terms of choosing products, and each product definitely was of a different size. It affected body to frame ratio, because if you want to show yourself in a t-shirt or so, well, it will be a larger body to frame ratio. And if it is kind of more about earrings, new earrings will be focused mostly on this part, and it would be smaller. And in this way, it will be larger body to frame ratio. And another thing which I noticed, which does not relate, well, it relates to some extent to visual perception and visual aesthetic, is that Russian participants and also Chinese participants, they came with pretty much preconceived and staged selfies. It was kind of a lot of arrangements to take the right image of yourself, kind of perfect. So some of Russian girls would even go to the hairdressers to have a hairstyle, choose specific place where the color of the walls in a cafe would match the color of her outfit, something like that. It was interesting. And just Americans were mostly focused on the brand. It was all about, if you tell us to take selfies with brands, we will take selfies with brands, and all focus will be on brands. If it is a selfie with a coffee brand, it will be a close-up of a coffee mug. So it will be really in front of the participant, not like near, like with Russian. It was more like accessory as part of your image. It was very much interesting. And also in terms of contrast, I included the slide, but just I didn't talk about that. Again, it seems like Russians in particular, they used color. So color matters for them to create contrast between their own image and the background information. So, well, whereas with American participants, the right luminance, the right lighting mattered a lot. Again, they chose the right lighting on the product. So that, again, more contrast on the product. Well, also some kind of qualitative interesting study. Yes. So, well, in general, so what I learned is that, yes, we do see these differences in user-generated products. Yes, people kind of take photos, like I take photos. I try to bring more context when I take a photo, and just my American friends and my husband, he says, what are you doing? You should take a photo like this, for instance. Well, or just definitely drawings. And but just when people evaluate, especially in kind of this visual search tasks or in some other cognitive tasks, they prefer simple images and well-balanced images. It's more about kind of good design and simplicity that helps them do what they are doing. A lot of
so just to follow, so in the kind of the highest body to frame ratio for Americans with favorite brands was really determined on the brands that they chose? You think?
In favorite condition, yes. In favorite brand
Okay.
condition, yes.
And then I guess my larger question is, so
I'm sorry, Timur. Timur,
Sorry.
do I pronounce correctly? I'm
Timur
sorry to
is
interrupt.
good. Sorry, am I cutting out?
No. So, well, not exactly. So when we compared compatible conditions of coffee and sunglasses, selfies, so well, there definitely culture showed effects. So both in sunglasses and coffee brand conditions, American body to frame ratio was larger and Russian body to frame ratio was smaller. But in favorite brand condition, there was no any effect. It was kind of insignificant, but it interfered, it showed this interaction effect because of that. Does it make sense?
I think so, yes. And so just because it's so much rich information, can you walk us through again, where the greatest sort of differences between the results from pilot 1 and pilot 2? In other words, I guess it's the difference between what people actually do and what they think is better, right? So where
Yes.
did they do not what they thought was better?
Exactly. They, again, yes. So culture matters when people create, generate this, whatever cultural progress, draw, paint, take photos, take selfies. Well, but their responses, and it showed across 2 studies, the pilot study when they took selfies and the main study, but their responses to evaluative responses to selfies did not show effects of culture, only with complexity. And again, complexity was given preference to by Chinese and Russian participants, but Americans, with respect with Americans, the results were insignificant. They were in the direction of less complexity, but the results were not significant. Yes.
Okay, I think we're at 1 o'clock, so we can pause the event and then have a little chat to end this. Okay, I'm ending the recording.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for a great
Thank you so
talk.
much for joining and just kind of spending your time. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.
You
Bye.
too.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. That was precipitous. All right, well, let's hope the recording generates. I think it's
Still live. I'm still seeing live, so I think we're still being live streamed.
Yeah, I can